I thought I would start by sharing a story about my favorite ever Minister of International Cooperation, Julian Fantino. Who, but actually, this was a number of years ago. He was giving he was doing like kind of a press conference release about funds that they were making available to respond to the Sahel crisis and what they were doing to help with the Sahel crisis, food crisis from a number of years ago. And after he made his announcements, everything, reporters asked him to comment on the slashing of what was CETA, of CETA's budget in the last budget, which had not been released not too far ago. And he said, "Well, there has been no reduction." And there was like very clear evidence that there had been. He said there was no reduction. And the reason he said that, I think, is very telling about where we went with respect to international development in this country, and especially in terms of the role of NGOs and civil society, Canadian civil society. He was referring to the fact that there had been no reduction in the envelope for humanitarian assistance. And so it was true, there actually had not been cuts to this portion of funds made available for humanitarian response. And I would say it's indicative because I think that became the thinking, was that, look, you guys, the NGOs, you're great when it comes to, feeding people when there's, drought and, getting shelter and doing all that kind of stuff for people at times of disasters. There's a role for you to play there. But when it comes to like poverty reduction and, development, and lifting people out of poverty, that's really the role of the private sector, not you guys. You don't really, and I can tell you that there wasn't really a lot of support for basically our mission statement as an organization, Development Peace, which says that we accompany communities in the Global South in the search for alternatives to unjust social, political, and economic structures, many of which are reinforced by our own policies here in this country. So a case in point during those dark years was the fact that we were trying to, as Joanne made reference to, run a campaign because our partners on the ground where we had development projects are telling us, look, this is great, you're helping us with this livelihood, but why don't you do something about your mining company next door, which just booted these people off of their land and poisoned our rivers, and now you have to help us find an alternative livelihood because you killed all the fish in the river and we don't have a livelihood anymore. So do something about that. So we're trying to do something about that. Meanwhile, the government was putting funds into how can we use our development budget to promote Canadian mining overseas, and because that's who's going to eliminate poverty. And I would say, interestingly, we had to be, and probably a lot of NGOs had to be very careful, and sneaky. We lost a lot of government funding during those years. We used to get these long contracts. We talked about, how the kind of funding terms, and we used to, even then, still short by those standards, but we would get a 5-year project approved to fund all kinds of our programs, and that went out the window. Where was I going with that? But that all changed, and I know, yeah. So we started getting money for humanitarian responses instead. And so even though we lost tons of money on that side, we actually probably, I haven't done the math, but we probably still have managed to get almost an equal amount of government money during the Harper years, but not for like what I would say in a lot of ways is at the core of our mission of trying to promote the long-term development, trying to go beyond the humanitarian response, but for the humanitarian side. And then you use colorful language to talk about how this is really a humanitarian project, even though we're trying to address a certain structure, that is perpetuating a bad situation in an emergency, context. Anyways, so I hope that will change, and I think that's the question. We see and we hear things that would indicate that would change, and that change would be that there is a recognition that NGOs in this country have a role to play when it comes to doing the work of really helping people to lift themselves out of poverty and doing long-term development work and not just simply responding to the latest disaster in the news. And you know, we will see. I was joking beforehand. We'll see. You know, it's too bad we're not having this a month from now, after the next budget will be released. And on that note, I thought I would say that we're part of and I don't know if people know this, but we're part of a network. There exists a network for Canadian international development NGOs in this country that is networked through something called the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. So it's a way that NGOs in the country can come together, put their heads together on policy issues, for example. And a good example of that is that the CCIC has put forward a submission into the budget consultation process. And I thought, since I know everybody's going to be, you know, loves reading budget submissions, I printed off 20 copies. So if anybody wants to take a copy, you're welcome to come up and take one before the night's over. But the submission that was given references the letter that Trudeau, so everybody knows probably Trudeau famously sent letters giving the marching orders to all the different ministers. And with respect to international cooperation, international development, this submission quotes from that letter where in the mandate letter, Trudeau wrote that the ministry was to refocus Canada's development assistance on helping the poorest and most vulnerable and supporting fragile states. In other words, a refocus away from what we saw a lot was, which was how to advance our economic interests, such as those of the extractive industries in other countries. So and I think that's a key word, refocus. And will we see that refocus as things move forward under this government? I think remains to be seen. I read an article saying that, you know, Canadians still approve Trudeau and we're past the honeymoon period. I don't know. For us, we're still kind of in the honeymoon period to wait and see, you know, where things are going to go and where we're headed. This is a great document if you want to know kind of what is the pulse of what NGOs are in this country are looking at in terms of where we go from forward here in terms of international development. The other thing that I wanted to just kind of end on is that when we started out almost 50 years ago, there were no international development post-secondary programs, really. And there's been it seems like almost every post-secondary institution now has some kind of program where you can study international development. And what we saw as opportunities for people in this country to be involved in international development beyond a mere volunteer capacity, but to actually make an engagement for international development their livelihood, at a time when we started producing more and more of these people, we had fewer and fewer opportunities for them. So we would go to these international opportunity fairs at different, we'd have kiosks at different universities and whatnot, and we would be looking for volunteers. And everybody would be coming to us looking for jobs. And so I think that's a real question. Also, it's not about, Fantino, again, my favorite minister, famously said, well, we're not around to fund the NGOs for life. Or, we're not here to fund the NGOs for life. It's not about, for us, I don't think, in the development community, it's not about, well, how much money is the government going to give us? It's about, there's a community of people in this country who live their lives in this country and are here and truly care about our place as Canadians in the global community and want to do something about advancing a vision for a more just world.
Here, here.
Oh. So let's see if our government can, how we can respond to that. If we can truly move on this path of refocusing. Because I would hope that if we're sitting here, in another 10 years, we can talk about, and there can be a lot more people who can talk about how this was a dawning of a time when more people who had a passion to be involved with international development were able to do so and do so effectively. And I will also end